Good afternoon, folks. We're going to get started this afternoon. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, and I'm chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and it's my honor to introduce Claire Jean Kim today, who is Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Kim's first book, Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict in New York City, Yale University Press, is a recipient of the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award for the best book on ethnic and cultural pluralism, and a best book award from the American Political Science Association organized section on race, ethnicity, and politics. Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, Cambridge University Press. Professor Kim's second book is also the recipient of a Best Book Award from the American Political Science Association, organized section on race, ethnicity, and politics. Professor Kim has written numerous journal articles, books, chapters, and essays, including the recent Are Asians the New Blacks? Affirmative Action, Anti-Blackness, and the Symmetry of Race in the Du Bois Review. And she is co-editor of a special issue of American Quarterly entitled Species, Race, and Sex. She is a recipient of a grant from the University of California Center of New Racial Studies and has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, and the University of California Humanities Research Institute. Her public-facing commentary has appeared in the Los Angeles Times and The Nation, and she is frequently interviewed by media on current events, including relating to race, social movements, animals, and ecology. She is currently completing a book entitled Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, from which she draws for today's talk. I introduce to you Professor Claire Jean Kim.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Neal. Thank you all for tuning in today. I want to express my thanks to the search committee, to the program in Asian American and Diaspora Studies, and also the Department of African and African American Studies. And thank you, Tyra, for organizing my visit. So this is my first chance to present material for my book that I'm finishing up, hopefully in the next few months. So I've been really looking forward to sharing my work with you today. Last month, I participated in a virtual roundtable on climate crisis, and the question they posed to us was, what has COVID taught us? And my answer, which was not particularly original, but still I think true, was that COVID has taught us in a compressed time frame what climate crisis is teaching us in an extended time frame, and that is that the relentless search for profits under capitalism disturbs the balance of nature, generating catastrophic events that land unevenly upon groups that were already differentiated by the articulation of race and capitalism, always already sorted into those who matter and those who do not, those who are grievable and those who are not. Black people have been among the hardest hit. Something's going on with my slides here. Let me see if I can advance them. Technical problem. Let me just end the show for a moment and see if I can get back in there. Okay. Black people have been among the hardest hit by COVID-19 in the US, according to the American Public Media Research Lab report, The Color of Coronavirus. Through most of the pandemic, Black people were dying at the highest rate of any group. A Guardian journalist writing about COVID-19's impact on Black Chicagoans asked if being Black should be considered a pre-existing condition for the disease. Last summer, the confluence of epidemiological violence, neoliberal capitalist violence, and police violence, specifically the murder of George Floyd, sparked a resurgence of Black Lives Matter and the largest uprising in US history. COVID-19 has adversely impacted Asian Americans too, but differently. Donald Trump's decision to call COVID-19 Kung Flu and the Chinese flu resulted in a surge of anti-Asian hate speech, harassment, and violence in public places. All of this is drawn in a deep vein of anti-Asian feeling that goes back to the Chinese exclusion movement of the 1870s, when nativists painted the Asian body as a diseased threat to white morality, health, and civilization. When Asian American advocacy groups organized events to condemn COVID-19 related racism, however, something interesting happened. They implied an equivalence between Asian American and Black experiences, even though COVID-19 statistics actually suggest a different story. A pronounced Asian Black gap. So I just put a few of these statistics on here. Asian Americans have the lowest age-adjusted mortality rate of any group. They are 3.3% of COVID-19 deaths, 5.6% of the population. Black Americans are 16.8% of COVID-19 deaths and 12.4% of the population, and have one of the highest age-adjusted mortality rates. Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than Asian Americans, and Asian Americans are the only community of color with a lower COVID-19 death rate than whites. So these figures are interesting to us because, in fact, they reiterate the Asian Black gap we see elsewhere in figures on median household income, educational attainment, residential segregation, intermarriage with whites, police violence, incarceration rates, so on. Yet the Asian Black gap is almost never discussed by Asian Americanists who instead tend to focus on the white-Asian gap, or what whites do to Asians under a regime of white supremacy. The discrepancy in structural position between Asian Americans and Black people remains for the most part untheorized, unexplored, and unthought, as Jared Sexton reminds us in his work, People of Color Blindness. As a result, there is a persistent indeterminacy about where Asian Americans fit in the U.S. racial order. In the paradigmatic scene where the white officer tells the Black man to assume the position, do we know where Asian Americans are and what they are doing? My book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, offers an original theoretical account of the structural positioning of Asian Americans, one that revises the theory of racial triangulation I advanced 2 decades ago. My departure point is philosopher Lewis Gordon's argument that the two principles defining the U.S. racial order are be white, but above all, don't be Black. Be white refers to the principle of white supremacy, but above all, don't be Black refers to philosopher Frantz Fanon's insight that negrophobia, or anti-Blackness, the phobic hatred or avoidance of Blackness, has been a structuring force in the modern world, fueling slavery and colonialism, and shaping the individual and collective psyche as well as the political economy. In the U.S., anti-Blackness is foundational to the social order in the sense that what it means to be American, what it means to be white, indeed what it means to be human, are all constituted against the foil of Blackness. My book asks, what happens when we bring foundational anti-Blackness back into the Asian American story from which it has been redacted? My argument is that Asian Americans are constituted at the disjuncture between white supremacy, a force that pushes all not white groups down below white people, and anti-Blackness, an even more powerful force which elevates all not Black groups above Black people. So Asian Americans are constructed fluidly and dynamically as not white, but above all, not Black. Where most scholars use either a white supremacy or an anti-Blackness frame, then I'm proposing that we think of both and how they articulate with one another. Not whiteness, in my book, is a form of structural disadvantage that renders Asian Americans vulnerable to economic exploitation, ostracism, and exclusion by white people, while not Blackness is a structural advantage that enables their mobility in relation to Black people. So not Blackness is a form of property, apropos of Cheryl Harris's discussion of whiteness as property, and also a public and psychological wage, apropos of W.E.B. Du Bois's analysis of whiteness. The Asian Black gap, then, is the difference between being not Black and Black in an anti-Black social order. Robin Kelly writes, to say that anti-Blackness is foundational to Western civilization is not to say that it is fixed or permanent, but rather that it is incredibly fragile and must be constantly remade. Structural anti-Blackness needs tending to, then, and this is especially true when the state sustains it under the cover of racial democracy. As the dialectical conflict between the Black freedom struggle and the U.S. racial state unfolds, How is anti-Blackness being shored up, maintained, and reproduced? How is Black critique being deflected and displaced? One stratagem that involves Asian Americans. Okay, I apologize for this. I'm having some technical issues. It's not the, okay, here we go. One stratagem that involves Asian Americans is what I call racial titration. Racial titration happens when Asian Americans are lifted up in order to better nail down anti-Blackness. So the axiom we could think of to simplify this is white is best, but the most important thing is not Blackness, or better Asians than Black people. We can think of racial titration as a structural tendency that plays out differently in different temporal and spatial scenes. For example, in the context of the Jim Crow South, it means granting Asian Americans provisional whiteness the better to reinforce the singular abjection of Blackness. In the context of California and the Cold War, it means allowing Asian Americans residential, social, economic, and occupational mobility as a performance of anti-racism that answers the Soviet charge of racism without disrupting the anti-Black order. After being advantaged in place of Black people as substitutes for Black people, Asian Americans are then invoked as an alibi for the anti-Black order, or proof that a minority group can thrive under American democracy and capitalism if only they have the right racial, cultural stuff. Each of the three parts of the book is an extended narrative arc that allows for a sustained interweaving and juxtaposition of Asian American and Black stories within a given temporal frame. Part 1, Exclusion Belonging, traces the construction of the Chinese immigrant labor across the periods of slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Part 2, Ostracism and Initiation, examines the Japanese immigrant experience in relation to nationwide racial segregation and lynching. Part 3, Identification Disavowal, looks at how the formation of a distinctly Asian American political subjectivity in the 60s produced a reckoning with white supremacy, but not with anti-Blackness, and how this incomplete political critique has complicated Asian American politics ever since. So because of time constraints, I'm just going to share a little material from each part. And I want to note up front that I hope that the book's framework applies to Latinx people as well, and other not white, not Black groups. So the goal of the book is really to help us understand how not white, not Black groups get dynamically positioned in an anti-Black order, how they get recruited and how they recruit themselves to reproducing that order, and what the prospects might be for a different kind of politics to emerge. Part 1, Exclusion Belonging. The classic narrative of 19th century Chinese immigration to the U.S. focuses on the white-Asian gap, or how the Chinese fared under white supremacy. By redacting structural anti-Blackness, it misses a crucial part of the story. So building on the work of historians such as Edley Wang, Moonho Zhang, Nadia Aramherio, Part 1 of my book brings anti-Blackness back into the story and rethinks the Chinese immigrant experience in relation to it. The second half of the 19th century was, of course, a time of tremendous upheaval in the U.S., as the conflict over slavery led to the Civil War, Reconstruction, Redemption, the establishment of Jim Crow, and eventually nationwide segregation. After the rupture of the Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction, structural anti-Blackness was reconsolidated step by step through systems of segregation, economic subjugation, and political exclusion, most obviously but not exclusively in the South. In this image from 1874, just before the end of Reconstruction, we see the White League and the KKK, two violent white supremacist groups, congratulating each other on reproducing slavery as closely as possible, or what you see in the sketch says worse than slavery. And at the top, you see the Union as it was. This is a white man's government, the lost cause. And please note at the left of, near the White League figure, above the cowering family, Black family, you see the lynched figure of a person who was lynched in a tree. Entering the scene during this tumultuous period, Chinese immigrant laborers were constituted as a distinct race, Asiatics or Mongolians, at the disjuncture of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Their not whiteness was a structural disadvantage that allowed capital to set them against white workers, who eventually took up the banner of exclusion in response. Their not blackness, on the other hand, was a structural advantage, which provided protection from the absolute abjection associated with blackness, creating a floor beneath which the Chinese could not fall. Both not whiteness and not blackness condensed in the idea of Chinese foreignness. Consider this advertisement for a laundry detergent called the Magic Washer. By the 1880s, Chinese laundrymen dominated the laundry business in San Francisco. What recommended the Magic Washer as a commodity, according to this flyer, was that it allowed white people to dispense with the Chinese laundryman, to finally expel this alien element from society. The Chinese must go, and you can see that slogan very faintly written at the very bottom, was the slogan of the Working Men's Party, the main organization behind the drive for exclusion. And you can see up in the left the ship that should be carrying the Chinese back over the Pacific to China. But Chinese foreignness was also paradoxically a sign of their not blackness. Consider that the slave or free black person was deracinated or seen as lacking nationality and a history. So in this is Peter Justice Daniel in his concurring opinion in Dred Scott v. Sanford. The African Negro race never have been acknowledged as belonging to the family of nations, that as amongst them there never has been known or recognized by the inhabitants of other countries anything partaking of the character of nationality or civil or political polity, that this race has been by all the nations of Europe regarded as subjects of capture or purchase, as subjects of commerce or traffic, and that the introduction of that race into every section of this country was not as members of civil or political society, but as slaves, as property in the strictest sense of the term. In relation to the slave, the Chinese were recognized as hailing from a once venerable civilization. As Chinese foreignness meant that the Chinese did not belong in the U.S., but they were acknowledged as belonging somewhere, as partaking of humanity and nationality, as enmeshed in webs of social and political relationality. Exclusion, therefore, expelled the Chinese from the U.S., but not from the family of man or the family of nations. Exclusion and belonging. In the youngest introduces the oldest. Let me see. Okay, I'm trying to get my next slide up. There we go. In the youngest introduces the oldest, published in Harper's Weekly, July 1868, Thomas Nast memorializes the signing of the Burlingame Treaty, which guaranteed certain protections for Chinese subjects living in the U.S. As a bilateral treaty between the U.S. and China, it signaled China's entry onto the world stage. The caption, which you can't see in the picture here, reads, "Brothers and sisters, I am happy to present to you the oldest member of the family who desires our better acquaintance." The woman representing America grasps the hand of a Chinese man of upper-class status and faces the world leaders, Europeans and the Turkish head of state, who bow in acknowledgement. This was a historic moment where the family of nations is being expanded for the first time to include selected non-European peoples. Importantly, China is depicted not as a new member of the family of nations, but as the oldest member, who had simply not been recognized as such, and is thus due a certain belated veneration. Note the absent presence of African leaders in this image. Most 19th century European ethnologists agreed that Asians were inferior to Europeans and superior to Africans. Arthur de Gobineau's schema was white over yellow over black. Georges Cuvier's schema was Caucasian over Mongol over Negro. In 1868, eminent German naturalist Ernst Haeckel published this sketch depicting relations among various primates. In descending order, the figures here are, in Haeckel's terminology, the Indo-German, the Chinese, the Fuegian, the Australian Negro, the African Negro, the Tasmanian, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the orangutan, the gibbon, the proboscis monkey, and the mandrill. Note the Chinese man immediately follows the European man, represented as usual by what looks like a statue of Apollo, and that the Negro figures, quote unquote, are directly adjacent to non-human apes. Global racial meanings shaped global labor flows and labor relations. The Chinese laborer was seen as degraded compared with the white worker, but nonetheless categorically superior to the slave. Entering spaces left open by Black departure or unavailability, particularly after the cessation of the British slave trade, the Chinese laborer promised something better. As Evelyn Hu DeHart has written, and more recently Lisa Lowe, the Chinese laborer, not white, but above all not Black, embodied the progression from slavery to free labor in 19th century global capitalism. This is why Chinese men, kidnapped or decoyed into being coolies in Cuba, were held in barracoons and starved and beaten for weeks until they would sign a contract like this one. The Chinese laborer was recognized as a custodian of his own freedom and a legitimate party to the labor contract. He could be coerced in ways that white laborers couldn't be, but unlike a slave, he first had to consent to being coerced. As the anti-Chinese movement tried to gain traction during Reconstruction, it faced a dilemma. How could it justify excluding the Chinese while naturalization and voting rights were being granted to Black people, at least on paper? Again, a Thomas Nast sketch tackled the issue of the day. In The Civilization of Blaine, published in 1879, Nast called out Senator James Blaine, Republican of Maine, presidential contender, and leading proponent of Chinese exclusion, for supporting rights for Black people, but not for the Chinese. Blaine, the imposing statesman, is shown physically supporting a diminutive, childlike Black man, who tenders a piece of paper with the word vote on it to Blaine, who in turn tramples a copy of the Burlingame Treaty under his foot. Importuning Blaine from behind is a Chinese gentleman of upper-class status, arms open, surrounded by the artifacts of Chinese civilizational accomplishment and commercial power. The caption expresses his query, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Nast's audience would have immediately recognized the slogan used by British and U.S. abolitionists in the fight against slavery. Nast's message was clear. Blaine's decision to promote Black inclusion and Chinese exclusion was so contrary to reason and treaty obligations, it could only be explained by his own political ambition. So it was under this specific pressure of justifying Chinese exclusion while granting Black people political rights, again on paper, that the Chinese had to be made out to be not just a little different from whites, but as the most unassimilable people on the face of the earth. This was accomplished by positing that assimilability and worth were inversely related values. It was precisely the venerable culture and civilization of the Chinese that made them fixed and unassimilable. It was Black people's lack of culture and civilization that made them plastic and able to assimilate. The Chinese had to be excluded not despite their superiority to Black people, but because of it. Consider the hearings held in California in 1877 by the Congressional Joint Special Committee to investigate Chinese immigration. Here is Senator Henry Cooper of Tennessee questioning Reverend Samuel Blakesley, an advocate of Chinese exclusion. Could it, granting the Chinese suffrage, not elevate them? No, sir. The African was compelled to become an American. He became American in taste, American in feeling, American in religion, American in habits, American in morality. Slavery compelled him to do that, but the Chinese never will, as far as human knowledge can tell. Can you not compel them the same way? No, sir. We have got to work on Chinese entirely by moral suasion. You are making the illustration on account of the lack of desire to work with them. Why will not the same remedy apply to laboring men here that applies in the South, where the race antagonism exists? Where you elevate the colored man, does it not do away with that antagonism? It does, but you have already made the colored man an American. Why would it not do to make the Chinaman an American in the same way? You cannot make him an American. Can you not make him a voter? That would not make him an American. Did it not make the Negro an American? The Negro was an American before he was a voter. Why may not the Chinese, after a generation, equally become citizens? Because we cannot reach them except through moral influences. The African was reached through the power of slavery and thus Americanized, but we have no power to make the Chinaman an American. Would not contact with our civilization have the same effect upon the Chinaman as upon the African? No, sir, because the Chinaman despises our civilization. He is proud of his own. He tells us in our face, "You are small potatoes. We were a great nation 3,000 years ago." There was no recourse to violence with the Chinese laborer then. He was ineligible for citizenship, yes, but he was also ineligible for enslavement. Once exclusion was secured through congressional legislation in 1882, the question shifted to how to get rid of the Chinese already living here. White San Franciscans showed astonishing creativity in trying to get the Chinese to self-deport. When they imposed onerous regulations on Chinese laundry operators, the Chinese fought back in the courts and sometimes prevailed. Okay, let's see what's going on. Oh, there we go. One such case was Yiquo v. Hopkins, 1886, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a San Francisco 1880 ordinance that was facially neutral but applied in a discriminatory way against Chinese laundrymen violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This was a striking contrast with the court's tolerance for segregation ordinances targeting Black people, as expressed in the civil rights cases 3 years prior. But the full historical import of the Yiquo case would not become clear for another 10 years. Scroll forward to Plessy V Ferguson, 1896, where the U.S. Supreme Court gave its imprimatur to Jim Crow, extending its life for another half-century. Homer Plessy, a man of mixed descent, challenged Louisiana's separate car law by riding in a white railway car. His attorney, Albion Tourget, argued before the court that the separate car law violated the 13th and 14th Amendments, and that the police power invoked by the Louisiana legislature in this case could be used to justify any arbitrary and discriminatory measure. So he was challenging the fact that the police power could be used in that way. Justice Henry Brown, writing for the majority, first dismissed the constitutional arguments and then wrote, "Every exercise of the police power must be reasonable and extend only to such laws as are enacted in good faith for the promotion of the public good and not for the annoyance or oppression of a particular class." Of course, this only begged the question, could the court ever be relied upon to call out a discriminatory police regulation as unreasonable? And here at the crux of the case that sanctioned Jim Crow, Brown invoked Yiquo for support. And here he writes, in Yiquo v. Hopkins, it was held by this court that a municipal ordinance of the city of San Francisco to regulate the carrying on of public laundries within the limits of the municipality violated the provisions of the Constitution of the United States if it conferred upon the municipal authorities arbitrary power. It was held to be a covert attempt on the part of the municipality to make an arbitrary and unjust discrimination against the Chinese race. So in this apparently unremarkable passage, something remarkable happened. Brown invoked the court's ruling in Yiquo as proof that the court would recognize and strike down a racially discriminatory law when it saw one. The court in Yiquo found the laundry ordinance to be an arbitrary and unjust discrimination because, quote, no reason for it is shown, and the conclusion cannot be resisted that no reason for it exists except hostility to Yiquo's race and nationality, unquote, which the court judged to be irrational and untenable. In Plessy, however, the court ruled that the separate car law was undertaken for the promotion of the public good, and thus reasonable. The difference was plain. Containing the contamination of blackness was the very definition of the public good, whereas no such phobic avoidance governed relations with the Chinese. Thus, Yiquo did not offer proof that the court would call out anti-Black discrimination in the future. To the contrary, Yiquo's favorable ruling had depended upon his not blackness. Denying the Asian-Black gap and implying an equivalence between the statuses of the two groups, Justice Brown pretended that the court's actions toward the Chinese were predictive of how it would act toward Black people. Through this sleight of hand, Brown used Yiquo to give the court cover as it nailed down Jim Crow for another half-century, which is to say Yickwo alibied the Plessy court and thereby Jim Crow. So what this inaugurated momentously was the historical practice of implying a false equivalence between Asians and Blacks, and then invoking Asian Americans as hedges against Black critique and alibis for the anti-Black order. Part 2, Ostracism and Initiation. The experience of Japanese immigrants arriving in the U.S. in the early 20th century has been narrated conventionally as a second Asian exclusion tale. Reminiscent of the first exclusion tale, whites, motivated by both economic self-interest and racial animus, organized over many decades to persecute Japanese immigrants, denying them naturalization rights, passing alien land laws at the state level, securing exclusion legislation at the federal level, eventually subjecting them to mass internment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were native-born U.S. citizens, were interned on the grounds that their loyalty to the nation could not be reliably ascertained during war. Like the story of Chinese exclusion, this one focuses on what happened to Japanese immigrants living under white supremacy. Structural anti-Blackness remains untheorized and unaddressed. So what happens to Japanese American history when we bring anti-Blackness back into the picture? For one thing, we become attuned to the means that whites employed to maintain Black abjection during this period, including the expansion of convict leasing and other racialized exploitative labor practices, the construction of residential segregation to corral and contain Black populations nationwide, and the use of lynching and race riots to police geographic and symbolic boundaries between white and Black in all areas of the nation. Lynching in particular was critical in maintaining an anti-Black order. The National Office of the NAACP in New York City used this flag to mark different lynchings in the 1920s and 30s. When so-called spectacle lynchings involving up to 10,000 participants, were advertised in the newspaper in advance, parents took time off of work and wrote their children emergency notes to excuse them from school. As Philip Dre recounts, they came from all over by the thousands, by train, bus, and car, for a family outing like no other. They bought snacks and photographs from vendors who set out their wares, hoping for brisk sales. The ecstasy of murdering Black people together was so keen for whites that they compulsively tried to extend it, not only through the preservation of the victims' body parts, but through the circulation of postcards featuring lynching photos to family and friends long after the event. David Marriott has described lynching as a rite of initiation through which the white father passed his white manhood as an inheritance to his white male child, the gift of being, quote, the man holding the knife instead of the man being cut, unquote. Kerry James Marshall's Heirlooms and Accessories extends this argument. Marshall uses an inkjet print of the 1930 double lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith in Indiana as the background of each part of the triptych, declining to sensationalize Black suffering. By showing the men's brutalized bodies, he fades out the image so that it is barely discernible in the background, instead drawing our attention to three white women of different generations in the lynch mob, whose faces he frames in lockets with chains. White women gain white womanhood through murderous violence against Black people as accessories to murder, and they pass this grim inheritance on as an heirloom to their daughters, who will in turn pass it on to theirs. Black suffering is the ground of white family and white reproductivity. In a symbolic, if not geographic sense, this was the scene Japanese Americans encountered upon their arrival, but this was not their first encounter with anti-Blackness, which was already a global phenomenon, in part because of the circulation of Western race science to Asia and other parts of the world. With Japan emerging as a world power following the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, many Japanese believed that Japan had almost caught up with the West, was more advanced than other Asian nations, and bore no comparison at all to backward Africa. In Outline of Civilization, 1875, Fukuzawa Yukichi, one of the leading thinkers in 19th century Japan, argued that the West was civilized Asians were semi-civilized, and Africans were savages. Accordingly, Japanese immigrants arriving in the U.S. embraced what Ichiro Azuma calls the Issei pioneer thesis, by which they wrote themselves into the history of the American West not as an oppressed group like other minorities, but as co-conquerors and co-pioneers with whites. This is a picture of the Manzanar internment camp in California. So historians, novelists, poets, and artists have shown us the trauma and injury that wartime internment inflicted on Japanese Americans. It is because wartime internment was clearly the low point of the Japanese American experience that it is revealing to look at what difference their not blackness made even in this historical moment. Most of the internment camps were located in the West, but two camps, Jerome and Rower, were located right here in Arkansas, the farthest east and south, a Jim Crow state. Arkansas also contained prisoner of war facilities for Germans and Italians and U.S. military training camps for black and white soldiers. Thus, the war brought multiple differently positioned groups into proximity within the carceral systems of the segregated South. It would be reasonable to assume that U.S. soldiers and ordinary Arkansans had the highest status among these groups, then internees, then enemy soldiers. In fact, white supremacy and structural anti-blackness inverted this hierarchy. White European prisoners of war had higher standing than Japanese American internees, who in turn had higher standing than black American soldiers and Arkansans, ordinary Arkansans. Even in the heat of wartime, race trumped citizenship, nationality, and allegiance. This is a photo from an Italian POW camp in Arkansas. Germans and Italian prisoners of war were treated with consideration and respect in these POW camps. As whites, they were allowed to attend local colleges and universities, which Arkansas Governor Homer Adkins refused to allow Nisei to do on the grounds that they might open the door for black people to enter. German and Italian officers had separate quarters that provided extra privacy and comfort. Entertainment included performances by brass bands, symphony orchestras, and theater groups, as well as screenings of American films. Tennis courts were open for use, and Italians could play bocce to get a taste of home. White residents objected to Japanese American internees working in town, but offered no resistance to German and Italian POWs who worked in town. Germans and Italians had taken up arms against the U.S., but in the eyes of white Arkansans, they belonged to the global brotherhood of whites, wherein anything could be forgiven. Although they were less privileged than white European POWs, Japanese American internees benefited from their not blackness. When they left camp on day leaves for shopping, school outings, and intercamp sports games, they were officially granted a provisional form of whiteness in the binary symbolic order of Jim Crow, which meant they were not only allowed to, but expected to patronize white stores, white hotels, etc. The bus, like the railway car, was a paradigmatic site of racial segregation, and internees were allowed, indeed required, to sit in the white section of the bus. John Howard notes the incongruity. Quote, even as federal prisoners, many Japanese Americans showed a significant ability to move in and across a number of spaces segregated as white, unquote. Neither black soldiers nor ordinary black Arkansans enjoyed this kind of mobility. Indeed, this was the point of the exercise. Japanese American internees were titrated up toward whiteness the better to keep black people down, the better to emphasize the singularity and immutability of black abjection. White is best, but the most important thing is not blackness. Better Asians than black people. Jerome was the first of the 10 internment camps to close, and internees marked the moment in late 1944 with extended festivities. Together, Japanese American internees and white camp staff put on what they called an all-American minstrel show. The event was advertised in advance in the camp newspaper, the Denison Tribune, with the headline, you can see it up here, you can see the headline up here, Minstrel Show slated for Thursday. This is one of several minstrel shows I've come across in the camps, but I don't know how common they actually were. What did it mean for Japanese American internees to put on blackface to mark their re-entry into U.S. society? Blackface, like lynching, is about building relationality, in this case, relationality among not Black people. After the dramatic aggression that was internment, with Japanese Americans poised to re-enter society, white camp staff and Japanese American internees used blackface to ritually affirm what had always bound them together, their not Blackness. The unequal encounter between the white camp administrators and the Japanese American internees they imprisoned was glossed by the party's equal participation in the riotous joys of blacking up. For the same reason, on his 1853 trip to force Japan to open to the West, Commodore Perry hosted a blackface minstrelsy show for Japanese officials on board his ship. This is a painting of that performance. The show was a hit, and one Japanese official afterwards exclaimed, "Nippon and America, all the same heart." From the moment the internment camps opened in 1942, the War Relocation Authority had been making plans to close them and resettle the internees. The Americanization program imposed on internees in the camps reflected this orientation toward post-camp assimilation. To understand the political pressure U.S. officials were facing at this moment, remember that the U.S. Black freedom struggle had been radicalized and internationalized during the interwar period, as Penny von Eschen and others have shown. Black leftist thinkers and activists such as Cyril Briggs, Claudia Jones, Chandler Owen, and W.E.B. Du Bois articulated a trenchant global analysis of how racism, colonialism, and capitalism worked in tandem to enrich Western capitalists at the expense of the majority of the world's population, the so-called darker races in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. This is an image from an American Negro Labor Congress publication in 1925. This turn in the Black freedom struggle posed a heightened challenge to the authority of the U.S. state, and the political legitimacy crisis deepened as the fight against Nazism generated new norms of racial equality, as Japanese propagandists spotlighted American race problems, and as the Soviets after the war resumed their habit of attacking the U.S.'s Achilles heel. And here we see two posters, Soviet posters, emphasizing the Achilles heel of the U.S., namely race relations. On the left is a 1930 publication where you see the Black person hanged from the Statue of Liberty. You see the implication of Christianity here, as well as capitalism in the bottom left. And on the right is a 1948 Cold War poster, and the words here say "under capitalism" on the left, and then "under socialism" on the right. On the defensive about Black segregation and lynching, U.S. officials conceived of and enacted Japanese American post-camp rehabilitation and resettlement as at least a partial solution to their global public relations problem. It was the same motivation that moved the state to recruit young men from the internment camps to form all Nisei combat units. If they could facilitate Japanese Americans' resettlement around the country and show their phoenix-like rise from the internment camps, if they could form all Nisei fighting units and show their patriotic valor on the battlefield, they could present Japanese Americans as an alibi for U.S. democracy and capitalism. Thus, Japanese Americans were titrated up or allowed increased social, occupational, and residential mobility, the better to preserve Black immobility. As Ellen Wu notes, this shift allowed Japanese Americans to enter the middle class during this period in a decisive way. Ostracism and Initiation. In Chicago, a popular resettlement site for Nisei, whites favored newly arrived Japanese Americans over Black people in the workplace, even when Black workers had seniority, and they allowed Japanese Americans to move into white neighborhoods while banning Black people. Eugene Ueki has shown that many Japanese Americans embraced their structural advantage and actively distanced from Black people by moving out of neighborhoods when Black people moved in, forbidding their children to marry Black people, and declining to engage in labor organizing with Black co-workers. Similar patterns emerged in Cold War San Francisco, where whites responded to wartime Black migration by doubling down on residential segregation for Black people and building separate public housing for them, while allowing Asian Americans to move into white areas for the first time. A study on housing discrimination in San Francisco, published in 1955, quoted realtors confirming Black people were the most phobogenic group and that Asian Americans benefited from being seen as the lesser of two evils. So the first quote, generally the feeling is against non-Caucasians, but most people will qualify this by saying they mind Orientals less than Negroes, or it is easier for Orientals than Negroes to buy homes. Japanese and Chinese are often accepted almost like whites. And Scott Kurashige describes the reflections of a Nisei Protestant minister in LA in the 60s who observed white sellers viewed Japanese Americans as a tolerable alternative to blacks who they feared would trigger a neighborhood invasion. And a lot of us are congratulating ourselves on working for and securing wide acceptance in the community at large, but I suspect that we've been bailed out by the Negroes. They moved in and frightened the whites, who then found that we Japanese weren't so bad after all. They could stop hating us and start hating the Negroes. Better Asians than black people. So thus far I've talked about the constitution of Chinese and Japanese immigrants as not white, but above all not black, and how both groups have been invoked as alibis for structural anti-blackness. With part 3, identification disavowal, I shift gears and look at how Asian Americans have responded to and negotiated their structural position. I begin with the Asian American movement that emerged in the late 60s, where activists broke from the earlier mode of distancing from blackness and declared themselves instead an oppressed minority, rising up with other oppressed minorities as part of a global third world liberation front against U.S. racism and imperialism. As historian Elizabeth Hinton has shown, this was a period when the groundwork was being laid for the rise of mass incarceration a decade or so later. How do we think about the through line from slavery to convict leasing and Jim Crow to the urban ghetto to the carceral state? Following Loic Wacom, we can look at the structural and functional continuities among these institutions. Following Saidiya Hartman, we can discern historical modes of racial subjection unfolding in the afterlife of slavery. As black urban uprisings proliferated in the mid to late 1960s, the U.S. state shifted into carceral overdrive rather than addressing the root causes of the unrest, namely the police violence and economic immiseration generated by structural anti-blackness and capitalism. The result, Jordan Camp writes, was the creation of, quote, neoliberal racial and security regimes, unquote, and the birth of mass incarceration. Emerging in Oakland in 1966, the Black Panther Party developed a critique of the carceral system that drew upon radical black internationalism, the philosophy of Malcolm X, and Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought. From the armed patrols they conducted to monitor police behavior in the ghetto, to the protracted campaigns to free political prisoners, especially the Free Huey campaign, the Panthers kept the carceral system firmly in their sights. Calling the police an occupying army was more than a metaphor. It spoke to the fact that the patrol car in the Oakland ghetto was part of the same racial and economic violence that U.S. imperialists inflicted upon third world peoples all over the world in pursuit of capitalist profits. And you can see here in this drawing by Emory Douglas in the Black Panther newsletter that it's the U.S. imperialist pig that is being strangled and told to get out of the ghetto, get out of Africa, get out of Asia, get out of Latin America. As part of an internal colony, as self-described colonial subjects, the Panthers vigorously opposed the Vietnam War and identified with the Vietnamese as oppressed people fighting for self-determination. In their view, the Black American soldier's true comrade was not the white American capitalist pig, shown here bleeding out on the ground, but the humble Vietnamese peasant. According to historian Daryl Maeda, the Black Panthers helped to launch the Red Guards, a radical Chinese-American organization that took root in San Francisco's Chinatown. The Red Guards emulated the Panthers in many ways, from wearing berets and uniforms, to embracing revolutionary nationalism, to setting up Serve the People programs, to writing a nearly identical 10-point platform. Playwright Frank Chin thought this imitation excessive and accused the Red Guards of engaging in blackface minstrelsy, a charge that Daryl Maeda tries to deflect by arguing that the Red Guards intended adulation, not denigration. Let's look at point 8 of the Black Panther Party 10-point platform. We want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We believe that all Black people should be released from the many jails and prisons because they have not received a fair and impartial trial. And then the Red Guards 10-point platform, which is verbatim, word for word, identical except that the word black has been replaced with the word yellow. So in retrospect, we can see that the Red Guards missed this opportunity to name the singular criminalization of Black people by the carceral system and the Asian-Black gap in incarceration rates. In fact, their substitutional rhetoric, yellow instead of black, obscured the gap. Ironically, the Red Guards' all-out identification with the Panthers constituted a non-recognition of their own not blackness and a disavowal of structural anti-blackness. Identification and disavowal, or identification as disavowal. The Asian American movement's failure to identify and denounce anti-blackness as it did white supremacy has haunted Asian American politics ever since, producing recurrent interpretive and political impasses. In my book, I look at how this played out in a number of scenarios, including the Japanese American reparations movement, the killing of Latasha Harlins by Sun Jadu in 1991, the LA Uprising of 1992, the Brian Ho lawsuit against the San Francisco Unified School District in the 90s, and the Harvard affirmative action case presently making its way up to the Supreme Court. Because of time constraints today, I'm going to just briefly discuss two other examples I address in the book and then make a few remarks to wrap up. And I want to really thank you for hanging in there with me. I know long lectures by Zoom can be very taxing, so thank you. So examples of how the Asian American politics has been haunted by this failure to name and address anti-blackness. First, the so-called model minority myth. Starting in the 1960s, Asian American thinkers and activists identified what they called the model minority myth and denounced it as a stratagem of white supremacy. According to their critique, whites habitually praise Asian Americans as a model minority whose success derives from Asian cultural traits. And this myth bolsters white supremacy by exaggerating Asian American well-being, blaming Black people for their failure to thrive, and dividing and conquering the two communities of color. In other words, whites make up the idea of Asian American success to splinter the Third World United Front. But as I mentioned at the start of the talk, COVID-19 reminds us there actually is a persistent Asian-Black gap that needs explaining. It is only by bringing anti-Blackness back into the story that we can see there is much more than a myth at play here, that there is a structural gap between the two groups, a fundamental discrepancy between their statuses. Whites do not just talk about Asian American superiority to Black people. In other words, they have been building a racial order around the idea for nearly 200 years. Thus, the critique of the so-called model minority myth, which has been central to Asian American thought and politics in the post-movement period, represents, in my view, a fundamentally misleading reading of U.S. racial dynamics. So what my book does is offer a critique of the model minority myth. One last example of how Asian American politics has been haunted by its disavowal of structural anti-Blackness. So we could see if we consider the killing of a Kai Gurley by Chinese American NYPD officer Peter Liang. In November 2014, Peter Liang entered the stairwell of the Louis Pink Houses, a New York City housing project in East New York, to conduct a vertical patrol with his partner. According to Liang, when he heard a noise below, he accidentally discharged his gun and the bullet ricocheted down the stairwell, striking and killing a Kai Gurley who was Black. Liang was convicted of manslaughter, later downgraded to criminally negligent homicide, and official misconduct, but he was given no jail time. Conservative Chinese immigrants, most of whom were professionals and relatively affluent, were outraged that Liang was prosecuted when white officers who had killed Black people had not been. As native Chinese speakers, they used WeChat and other Chinese social media platforms to organize demonstrations in more than 40 cities across the U.S. As Black Lives Matter protesters called for Liang to get prison time, a demonstration in Brooklyn drew 15,000 Chinese Americans in support of Liang. And you can see some of the signs here. No scapegoating, treat every officer equally, Peter scapegoat, no selective justice, tragedy, not crime. The optics were striking. Journalist J. Caspian Kang wrote, "No amount of nuance or qualification or appeal to Martin Luther King will change the fact that the first massive nationwide of Asian American protest in years was held in defense of a police officer who shot and killed an innocent Black man. In the paradigmatic scene where the officer tells the Black man to assume the position, what happens when that officer is Asian American? This question became more urgent after former Minneapolis police officer Tu Tao, who is Hmong American, was charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder in the death of George Floyd. Once again, because they focused exclusively on white supremacy and do not address structural anti-Blackness, Asian American advocates, most of whom are center-left politically, have no conceptual language with which to discuss these scenarios, no way to speak back to the conservative Chinese Liang supporters who declare Asian Americans first, or more precisely, Chinese Americans first. If Asian Americans were to theorize structural anti-Blackness and the Asian-Black gap, that is, if they were to complete the critique left unfinished by the movement, what would they say? They would ask whether the killing of Akai Gurley could fairly be called an accident, even if Liang hadn't meant to pull the trigger. Akai Gurley died because poor Black people in urban areas are segregated and corralled in public housing, where police officers patrol their living spaces with guns drawn, treating everyone as a criminal suspect. Indeed, one is struck by the non-randomness and non-accidentalness of Akai Gurley's violent death, the predictability and overdeterminedness of it, and how Black life is lived in a distinct relation to death, in adjacency to death. If Asian American advocates theorize structural anti-Blackness, they would point out that Chinese complaints about the selective prosecution of Liang are tantamount to a demand that Chinese American officers be allowed the same right as white officers to kill Black people with impunity. They would ask if Liang supporters were really seeking racial justice as they claimed, or whether they were instead bidding to become equal shareholders with whites in an anti-Black order. They would ask, with Wen Lu, who embedded with the pro-Liang protesters as an ethnographer, whether the Chinese American dream was, in her words, quote, a neoliberal transnational dream of class advancement, unquote. They would ask, what are Asian Americans' investments in the current regimes of private property, policing, and capital accumulation? And what, in fact, was Jordan Peele saying in his acclaimed film Get Out, when he had the sole Asian American character bidding alongside whites for the use of a Black man's body at a modern-day slave auction? So let me say in closing that despite their rise to prominence lately, conservative Chinese immigrants who defended Liang may not have the last word on what it means to be Asian American. Since the emergence of Black Lives Matter in 2013, and especially since the murder of George Floyd, more Asian Americans are expressing support for the Black freedom struggle and calling out anti-Blackness in their own communities. Asians for Black Lives, Letters for Black Lives, Model Minority Mutiny all testify to this shift. Especially among younger Asian Americans, there is a desire to think in new ways about their relationship to anti-Blackness. I've been invited to many events where the theme is, how can Asian Americans be good allies to the Black struggle? My answer is that it is never too late to complete the political critique that the Asian American movement began, because being good allies will require that Asian Americans go beyond the critique of the so-called model minority myth and reckon with the structural Asian-Black gap. It will require Asian Americans interrogate the structural advantage of not Blackness, even as they challenge the structural disadvantage of not whiteness. It will mean reconstituting Asian Americanness as a force that destabilizes rather than reinforces the racial and economic order. Whatever direction they choose to move in, Asian Americans and other not white, not Black groups have a role to play in deciding how long structural anti-Blackness persists and what we might imagine in its place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Claire. For those of you who might have questions, might I suggest that you use the hand raise function, and we can begin this conversation with Claire.
If they want to unmute their cameras, they can.
That's fine. Yeah. I'll start with the questions, Claire. How do you read everything that's taken place in the months up to January 6th and post January 6th to kind of frame where Chinese Americans are framed within the context of everything that's happened in terms of the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Is there a particular moment or particular incident you're referring to, or just
I mean, just generally. I mean, I'm struck by the commentary of Congressman Liu
Mhm,
a few days ago in terms of a kind of truth telling
mhm.
about that moment. And I think he specifically talks about it in that context. But generally, as you speak, because of the black white dichotomy in which we talk about race in this country, we actually have not seen a lot of commentary from Asian Americans in the context of this.
Right, right. So, one of the ways that I approach that in the book is to talk about the convergence of white nationalism that we're seeing in the American political scene and U.S. political scene, and conservative Chinese immigrant nationalism, because the conservative Chinese immigrant groups who are behind the affirmative action case at Harvard and UNC and other places, and also behind the the gutting of SCA5 in California many years ago. Um, they are their views about meritocracy, desert, equality, freedom really dovetail in an important way with people on the right wing, in among white Americans. So there's that there is that convergence there, which I think is really important. And one of the my future projects, I hope to look at white nationalism. And one of the questions I want to ask is, in what way are incoming immigrant groups, when they have a conservative bent, as we see among some Vietnamese Americans, for example, some Chinese Americans, to what degree is there an ideological convergence between these groups and white nationalism, and what does that portend for white nationalism's openness to non-black groups, right, who might be coming in with sort of similar ideologies? I think that's sort of an unexplored, interesting angle there. But Ted Lieu, of course, represents progressive Chinese Americans, progressive Asian Americans, and who are speaking out against, right, what they see as the rise of proto-fascism, if not fascism, on the U.S. political scene in a very shocking way. Although most of us would say, right, who are observers of politics, this has been coming for a long time, and that's what's interesting about it is that even though January 6th was this watershed, we can look at all of the precursors and all of the predictors that led us to that moment.
Thank you, Claire. Sam?
Thank you very much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the agents who populate this study, and who precisely are the architects of this structural system of advantages and disadvantages that you've described. There are clearly a lot of them, and a lot of different types of them. You mobilize advertisements suggesting that capital is one of them. Court cases suggesting that it's the state, but also a more nebulous thing like public sentiment that is driving it, that is not captured by any of something so straightforward as an ad or a court case. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you weigh those different agents or architects against one another, in describing how this system that you described came into effect over the longue durée.
Wow, that's such an
Sorry
interesting.
if that's a crazily huge question.
That is a crazily huge question, but it is really interesting and something I want to think a lot more about. One of the things that happens when you're trained as a political scientist is you can't use the passive tense. You always have to say X did something, and you have to like be very clear about who the agent is. And the first thing that happens in political science is if you use the word state, right? At least 10 people raise their hand and say, "Well, what do you mean by the state?" Right? You have to disaggregate that. So one of the sort of liberating things for me about not just being in political science, but also speaking to people in ethnic studies and the humanities and elsewhere, is the freedom to be a little looser with that, right? And not to sort of try to just pin down, well, the majority of this group said this, because there are some truths. This is what I feel writing this book, which are accessible only if we kind of relax that concern about who is directly responsible and how many we can say, and disaggregating the agent. But in response to your question, one of the reasons that I use the term racial state in the book manuscript is that, and it's sort of just an obvious way of saying the state is actively involved in the reproduction of this racial order, right? It's not a neutral entity like in liberal theory, and it is actively involved. And one of the reasons, like I'll give you a very specific reason that matters. There's a lot of discussion in the in court cases and also in different kinds of governmental hearings about whether the state was responsible for slavery in the U.S. Right? Was slavery really just something that corporations and that capitalist interests put together? Is it really private interests and that the individual slaveholder who's responsible, but the state didn't really do anything? And this is an argument you see repeated right through history. We're seeing it now with regard to the reparations movement. So just to use the word racial state suggests the state is always involved in all of this. And I'll give you a good example of how they were. Just one example. In the case of the rehabilitation of the Japanese Americans during and after World War II, because this began during the war, it was the War Relocation Authority working with a number of other government agencies to produce a public relations campaign that would get white Americans to say, oh yeah, Japanese people aren't that bad. They're not traitors. They can live among us as neighbors. And then to actively set up field offices which would help the Japanese Americans resettle by helping them with funding, helping them finding housing opportunities, job opportunities. So there was a sort of a concerted effort on the part of the government to facilitate that movement. Yes, capital's also involved here in both of the stories that I've told, and public sentiment is there as well. Also, Asian Americans themselves were very, very crucial agents. And I'll give you an example. Again, going back to the Japanese American example. If you look at how Japanese Americans were seen and treated by the US government and by the US public from like the 1930s to the 1970s, let's say, or 1980s, the Japanese American Citizens League, right, which played this critical role in before, during, and after internment. It was the leading Nisei organization at the time. It was a organization very concerned with assimilation and getting naturalization rights and sort of declaring the Americanness of Japanese Americans. And Mike Masaoka, in particular, who was a JACL leader, was such a pivotal figure, I find, in researching this book, in helping the U.S. government along in seeing Japanese Americans in a particular way. And his Japanese American Creed, which he wrote and got read on the floor of the U.S. Congress, I believe in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, his Japanese American Creed, I read in the book as sort of a counterpoint to Black internationalist critique, in the sense that he takes every and other statements by Masaoka, he takes every charge that Black radical internationalists are making about the U.S. government's involvement in militarism and violence and racism and imperialism, and he sort of flips it around and says the U.S. government is doing these great things. It's allowing me, as a Japanese American, to live a great life. And so even though Black people are not mentioned, Black critique is not mentioned, it's like he's saying through his various statements, we Japanese Americans are offering a different kind of minority politics, right? One that is not critical of the state, one that in the face of internment says, do whatever you will, we will not question, we will not critique the state. And I actually refer to this in the book as post-contractual citizenship, a post-contractual idea of citizenship. Like, forget the exchange that's supposed to be involved, where the state protects the citizen and the citizen offers allegiance. We will offer allegiance regardless of whether you're protecting us or not. So in this case, we see Japanese Americans, at least those, again, we got to disaggregate, at least those represented by the JACL. And there were many dissenters who did not like where the JACL was going. But at least the JACL actively involved in constructing this idea of the Japanese as rising like a phoenix, right, from the ashes of internment, as leaving Black people in their dust, as transcending Blackness. We see Asian Americans really actively involved in that as well.
Thank you, Claire. Lee Baker?
Thanks so much. This was very informative, and I have a ton of questions, and you created a lot of questions too, so it was a great lecture. So my question, I totally get this Asian Black gap, but my question is, for those Asians that are refugees and or formally colonized, like Filipinos, and I'm talking maybe Vietnamese, Cambodians, Hmons, that gap isn't so great. It seems to me that the refugees and the former colonized subjects have a different role in America to play, or it didn't play out in such a model minority sort of way. What role does the type of immigration play in this Asian Black gap?
Yeah, yeah, that's an important question, and I think that that'll lead me to talk a little bit about where I think Asian American Studies has been in recent years, which is there's been a lot of focus on um, internal heterogeneity, right? Internal differentiation among groups within Asian America, right? By national origin, class, etc. And there's been, from the very beginning of the Asian American political subjectivity, so going back to the 60s and the movement, there's been from that moment on a concern by some of the groups you mentioned, right? Southeast Asian Americans and Filipino Americans, also Pacific Islanders when they were lumped in the census with Asian Americans, that Asian American is a category that essentially means East Asian American, and the groups who aren't East Asian American get ignored and invisibilized even further within that category, right? And so, to give you a specific example of how that might work, for example, in the case of Brian Ho versus San Francisco Unified School District in the 90s, when Chinese American plaintiffs tried to end the race conscious admissions program at Lowell High School in San Francisco, they were fighting for the admissions committee there to raise the cap so that more Chinese American students could come in. But it ended up they were fighting against race conscious admissions when those race conscious admissions helped other Asian origin groups who were not as well represented as the Chinese, for example, Filipinos. So, but the Chinese American groups that were fighting for the end to race conscious admissions called themselves an Asian American group, right? So we see that in higher education around race conscious admissions, we see the distinction between East Asian groups, which are doing better, and Southeast Asian and Filipino groups, which are not doing as well in terms of representation in elite colleges and universities and high schools. So that is, and we see from the beginning of the Asian American movement, particularly among Filipinos, for example, this sense that, yellow power, right, the cry of the 60s, didn't apply to them, that they didn't consider themselves a yellow people. They consider themselves in a different category. So there's always been that tension among Asian Americans and within the Asian American political subjectivity, such that it is, how do you talk about a collective entity when it's riven by so many different axes of differentiation and inequality? So that's all, I think, taken for granted when we look at Asian American studies that that's going on. But I think that the field also needs to, in addition to looking at internal inequality and differentiation, look at how Asian Americans are situated relative to other groups. And I think sometimes that is what gets less attention when we need to actually be looking at both. Well, what I like about your question, and one reason I'm interested in the question is I think we can do both at the same time. So, for example, if I'm making the argument, right, that all Asian people, all people who are considered Asian by the state, by the, by white society, um, have, all of them are seen as having a certain kind of property of not blackness, right? That would be my argument, that regardless of what their economic situation is, regardless of the mode of entry into the US, refugee or immigrant, regardless of their particular socioeconomic status, that they all, as people who are seen as Asian, have the property of not blackness to advantage them, or in James Baldwin's words, right, like they all have something to lose, which is that not blackness. It doesn't mean they all have it in the same way, right? And so one way we might look at that is to say, how by class or by mode of entry might we qualify the argument about not blackness? And that could be a really interesting project. So I don't want to say I think that, I disagree with your question. I think that it opens up really interesting questions, interesting avenues to explore.
Thank you, Claire. Amy?
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much. That was amazing talk. I love the way you've did this synchronic, diachronic, bringing histories that we all sort of know about from high school, and really reframing it in a way that just blows up some of the assumptions that we've had. So my questions, I think you answered some of it, but can you address, and I also like the domestic and the transnational, and from history to the present, that just really vast. But could you maybe talk about the gap in the immigration policies, right, that bring up the gap in the Asian American communities, right? And that goes back all the way to the past, historically, where you always have these two dichotomized groups. You have the laboring or the refugees, right, from all the wars that American empire is waging. And then you have the brain drain, and then also the allies, right, from the Cold War and so forth. And so there is this huge gap in the immigration population, and that was by design. And then just the gap in our education, right? And so as new immigration waves come in, even Americans, right, who've been born here, we have like no education on this. So of course, the new immigration communities who come in, the new Chinese right now, of course they don't know this history, and they're kind of caught in the middle. And you talked about how when the Chinese came in, when the Japanese Americans came in, they're sort of caught in this space where they just are, kind of decontextualized. So, I mean, what can we do going forward to create consolidation, solidarity within this larger gap?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by create solidarity? Oh, you mean between Black people and Asian people?
Right. Especially within when you have such a gap within the Asian American community itself that is structurally created throughout history, plus the education gap where even Americans, we don't learn this history. And certainly the immigration, the new waves of immigrants, refugees, the brain drain, they don't have any context. So, what can we do going forward? Because, it's not, I don't think it's just bad actors who are sort of siding with white supremacy. It's structurally, right, where we're sort of, we're all participating in this, right, whether we are intentional or not. So some, strategies.
Strategies. Okay. Well, right. So as you mentioned, the various overlapping immigration laws over the 20th century have created different kinds of immigrant and refugee streams from Asia coming into the U.S., which produced very differently situated populations. So even within Chinese America, right, you can see those kinds of huge differentiations. Some of the most progressive, most radical Asian Americans in terms historically have been Chinese American. And then today we're seeing the most conservative, the strongest, most conservative Asian Americans are Chinese Americans, new immigrants. So yes, we see all of that kind of variety and unevenness in immigrant populations because of those laws. When you say that new immigrant Chinese people or new immigrants generally don't know the history, yes and no, I think to that question, because I think people in the US don't know that history either, right? So, I mean, yes, I was raised in the US. Yes, I heard about the civil rights movement. I think it was 2 paragraphs. And I heard about slavery, and I think it was 1 paragraph, right? So, in my US history book. So, I grew up here, but I still didn't know the history. I got all the way to grad school, and I didn't know the history, right? I had to basically educate myself at some point. And then, so it's not as though we can sort of create a an educational program for new immigrants, and then if they would, and because who would create it? The people who created, right, the educational system we have now, which is not educating U.S. citizens. Also, there is really, I think Wen Lu's piece in Journal of Asian American Studies, she's the ethnographer I said, kind of embedded with the pro Liang forces in New York. It's such a powerful piece because she's really saying the people who come here, and this is across the board. I'm trying to push back against the idea that Asian immigrants come here with no ideas about race, nothing, it's a blank slate. They don't think about Black people, they don't think about Blackness. um, they're a blank slate. They don't even have any ideologies, right? They just come here wanting to create a good life, right? That whole depiction is so ideologically laden. And in fact, they come here traveling on global circuits of capital, anti-blackness, and other things, right? So they're already formed in the, the same way that we are formed who already live here. Many of them, as Wen Lu points out, resist ideologically the story that some of us might want to tell them about slavery, about the afterlife of slavery, etc. They have a neoliberal class advancement idea in their head, and that's what is drawing them here, and that's what draws them to Trump, and that's what draws them to fight affirmative action, right? So they're fully formed ideologically, just like you and I, right? So, and not to say that they can't change their views, but it's not as, sometimes you hear Asian American advocates saying, well, these immigrants don't know the history, and if they did, they would feel differently, right? So I think it's, unfortunately, it's harder than that. But in terms of solidarity across the gap, I mean, that is really the question I'm getting at, right? That's what I'm hoping the book helps us do, because the first thing you have to do to have solidarity across a gap is to acknowledge there's a gap. And that's the problem, is we've been trying to have solidarity across the gap without saying there's a gap. In fact, denying there's a gap. And that's really impossible to do. And like Laura Polito's book on the left in LA in the 60s is so interesting, because she talks about how Asian American activists, going back to the 60s, there was this unspoken thing going on when activists got together, this unspoken realization that Asians were not in the same place as the other groups, right? They just weren't living the same experience as the other groups. So when they tried to join these coalitions, there was sort of a, on the part of Black and sometimes Chicano people, there was sort of a distancing going on, like, we're not sure about you guys, a lack of interest in engaging Asian Americans, because the elephant in the room was there was this gap and people weren't talking about it. So I hope that the book contributes to thinking about ways of having solidarity that are not also ways of having disavowal, right? Because the way that we're doing solidarity now, to me, reads as a disavowal. So how do you have solidarity without doing that? How do you have solidarity in a way that really acknowledges and engages anti-blackness? And as you said, it's not just about bad actors. And this is one of the central questions that comes up in the book, and it's very difficult to deal with. And I watch Asian Americanists deal with it in different ways. And that is, how do you deal with the question of implicatedness, complicity, right, on the part of Asian Americans? And you can see how much anxiety there is among Asian Americanists over this issue, because a lot of the language that is used, pawns, scapegoats, human shields, right? A lot of the language coming out of Asian American studies expresses this anxiety, this sense of being haunted, that there is a way that we're complicit, there's a way we're implicated that hasn't been fully named or acknowledged. And how do we, sort of deal with that situation? And, in truth, many of the groups I'm studying historically, they respond to the structural incentives that are offered to them, right? There are structural incentives and disincentives. most people are going to go along with the incentives. They're going to try to have a decent life. They're going to try to distance from blackness because that's what gives them the most goodies, right? That's what gives them the easiest life. There have always been historical actors who pushed against that, right? Who named what was going on. But most people go along with structural incentives and structural advantages. So that's a question we have to cope with or engage with, I think, and have really difficult conversations about. But that's the kind of conversation that has to happen if you really want to get to solidarity.
Thank you, Claire. We're going to take two more questions, starting with Jessica.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Kim, so much for that. My question was sort of answered a little bit when you answered Lee's question, but I'm curious about how South Asian Americans fit um, into your book or into your thinking about this. Of course, anti-Blackness is a huge problem in the South Asian American community, and thinking about Vijay Prashad's Karma of Brown Folk and him thinking about the model minority myth. There's also been a lot of work recently trying to rethink sort of the history of Black and South Asian migrants, Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem, for instance, and even culturally, of course, we got Kamala Harris now, so it's something everybody's thinking about. But in terms of thinking through sort of reasons for solidarity, internationalist thinking, of course, in Bombay in the 1970s, there were the Dalit Panthers building up Black Panthers. And it seems like a lot of sort of movements for South Asian Black organizing solidarity get erased by the attachment of a lot of upper caste Hindus to white supremacy. Which we can see, of course, between the BJP government and the Trump presidency. Anyway, having said all that, like, how do you see South Asian Americans fitting into the paradigm here?
Raised a lot of good points and a lot of things for me to think about. So yes, I think Vijay Prashad's writing on anti-blackness was really stands out to me because it came so early, right? A lot of more people are writing about it now, but I think it was a really good example of Asian Americans trying to talk about the issues. One thing I think distinguishes my book from some of the earlier attempts to engage anti-blackness is there's a tendency, especially in activist circles, but sometimes also in scholarship, to think about anti-blackness as like prejudice, in the sense that people are addressing it as internal. Like, we need to look in our hearts and minds. Need to look in our communities. Like, you often hear Asian Americans need to address anti-blackness in their communities, right? So it's not just an internal thing, although that's true too. It's also a structural thing, right? So the point of the book is to say we live in an anti-Black order, meaning not just that we're shot through with anti-Black affect, but that we use Black abjection as a foundation for sociality and relationality of other kinds. So that seems to me really important as a way to complement Prashad's work. Yes, and I've seen South Asian efforts at Black, solidarity with Black people. You also see conservative South Asians, as you alluded to. For example, the conservative Chinese immigrants that I've been studying, the only two other Asian groups that they've gotten any traction with are South Asian and Korean. So conservative people in those groups. But yes, you also alluded to this wonderful history, right, in the early, let's say the first part of the 20th century, where Black radical internationalists are really taking on, solidarity with India in particular, showing a lot of interest in Indian liberation, learning from India. So I think that's a very important part of that history. But South Asians, like other Asians, I think, and again, with South Asians, we have to say, there'll always be the argument: do people really see them as Asians, etc. But to the extent that they're seen as Asians, I still think that they have not Blackness, and especially with South Asians, some of them being very economically privileged, that just sort of amplifies that status. So um, again, with South Asians, with Filipinos, with Southeast Asians, with any group that is considered Asian to that degree, I think it's a group that has been constructed as primarily not Black, and therefore having those kinds of advantages, and that's something that has to be addressed directly.
Last question, Lena.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Kim. It's an honor to hear you speak today and share so many wise words. I think you addressed this a little at the beginning of your talk, but given that we now have sort of the context of your book and some of the ideas that you're putting forward, I was wondering, I would really love to hear your take on sort of the Asian Americanist response to violence and so-called hate crimes in the past few weeks, and sort of the actions that different organizations are taking, as well as celebrity response, which has been plus minus. Yeah, I would just love to hear your thoughts on that. I think it would be really rich. Thank you.
Plus minus, what does that mean?
It means that I was scrolling through like NBC Asian America and I saw Lea Salonga say that this is like the Asian Lives Matter moment, is what that means.
That's thank you so much, Lena, for that question, because I have been thinking about that a lot. I have actually been doing some media interviews on that, and so I have thought a lot about this issue. The first thing I would say off the bat is we do not know, no one knows yet whether these are quote unquote hate crimes, whether these are racially motivated attacks, right? So if you look at the attacks on Asian elders in San Francisco, there's still no evidence that these are racially motivated. But in my view, there's a rush to call them racially motivated because it fits within a particular narrative. And going back to Professor Neal's work, right, of Black masculinity being legible if it's criminal, right? That's the only Black masculinity that becomes legible. So in my view, there's a rush to judgment that these are hate crimes. And then even then, right, the whole hate crimes framework, I think, is really troubling because not only because it links us directly to expanding the carceral state, but because the term hate crimes, the concept of hate crimes, equivalences among different groups, right? Black people commit hate crimes against Asian people. Asian people commit hate crimes against Black people. We immediately lose the historical context that my book is trying so hard to introduce into the conversation, right? That idea of discrepancies and gaps and inequalities. Another observation I have about these recent events is violence against Asian Americans. Well, first of all, there's been a huge upsurge we see, right, in reported crimes, and reported attacks, and we know if it's reported, if there's like 10 reported, there's 100 that are unreported, right? So we know there's been a huge upsurge. According to the last article I read, 70% of these are verbal attacks and 20% are shunning and avoidance, right? So it's like 9.8% that are physical attacks. So, which isn't just minimize that in any way. I mean, as an Asian American, you know, I've experienced some version of some of this, not a physical attack, but some of the other stuff. So I'm not minimizing it in any way. We all get concerned when elders are being knocked down in the street, right? So this is obviously concerning, but what I see in terms of historical patterns is Asian Americans get targeted for these kinds of things when, you know, periodically, right? When there are things going on geopolitically that seem to warrant this. For example, World War II or the trade war with Japan in the 80s, right? That the Vincent Chin, et cetera. So we see it periodically, cyclically, depending on geopolitical events. So in other words, the violence against Asian Americans is largely contingent. It's contingent upon these events. Violence against Black people, I think, in an anti-Black society is not contingent, right? It is actually structural violence. And, you know, going back to Orlando Patterson's discussion of gratuitous violence against the slave, and then connecting that to Saidiya Hartman's argument about the afterlife of slavery, there is gratuitous violence, and we see it built into policing, we see it built into mass incarceration, and that's a different kind of violence. So any kind of violence against groups that's racially connected is very worrisome and objectionable, but I think we have to make those kinds of analytical distinctions too.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for your presentation and your willingness to take so many interesting questions. Thank you for all of you who attended, and everyone take care.